I wasn't supposed to find this. That thought kept returning as I stood in the dust-sweet hallway of the decommissioned county annex, a structure that didn't exist on any map newer than 1973. The building wore its neglect like a damp coat, humidity lifting the paint in pale fish scales, air saturated with the mineral tang of old plaster and the clean rot of paper. The lights didn't work, but the windows were skinned over with parchment tape, so everything felt underwater, the silence viscous, my breath the only sound that dared move. I'm not a trespasser by trade. I pull at loose threads in archives. Public records, private collections, university basements, my work is sanctioned discomfort. This is what I discovered because a reference librarian in Helena, Preston Honest, said, "We don't catalog territorial ledger B, no such unit." Sorry, then leaned in and added, "If it exists at all, it's off-site." Off-site, as in here, a utility spur behind the old poorhouse, never reassessed, never demolished, an address that stopped answering the roll call of buildings sometime during the Carter years. The first door opened on metal shelves coated with ash-gray fur, dust so thick it deadened the echo of my footsteps. The second door refused until I shoved my shoulder into swollen wood. The smell hit me, cold iron, mouse urine, cardamom from a long-decayed insect repellent, and beneath it, a note like wet pennies. My phone's flashlight stuttered across crates. Crates gave way to bundles. Bundles gave way to a ledger. It sat alone on a lath table, bound in tar-black buckram. Wax had been poured over the clasp and then cut clean, as if someone could open it only once without leaving guilt behind. Hand-lettered on the spine, Hollow Doctrine/Conduct and Physio/St. August, Zem/1874 to 1880. The top edge held a pale bloom of mildew. When I lifted the cover, the smell shook loose, sweet, tannic, old animal glue. The first pages were benign, if dull, attendance, temperatures recorded in careful pen, notes about coal allotments and sanctified soap. Then the ink turned patient and precise. Observations on the Donnelly Family, Territorial West, collected via County Relief, Parish Mission, and St. Augustine Seminary Infirmary. The name recurred in neat columns: Donnelly, infant, Donnelly, adolescent, Donnelly, mater, Donnelly, pater. Next to each, the same notation, H.O. I touched the page. The ink had bite under my fingertip. H.O. again and again, sometimes circled, sometimes underlined. Hollow zero? Hollow doctrine? I didn't know. But a number began to follow me through the text, 11. It hung in the corners of pages, carved into the cedar of the book's block with a pin. 11, 11, 11, like a knuckle tapped on a table. At the back of the ledger, they had taped in clippings and confidential slips. 1, typed on onion skin, Montana Territorial Board of Charity, 1876. Subject, irregularities in genetic inheritance observed among Donnelly line. Another, handwritten in heavily redacted, recommendations, removed from census, reassign identity through seminary foster protocols. The doctrine holds if hollowed. The core was blacked out to the margins. Whoever did it wasn't careless, the brushstrokes were deliberate, shiny. There were residue fingerprints pressed into the lacquer. Mine joined them. Above me, a pipe breathed, just once, like a distant animal. I set the ledger down to look for more. The room answered with silence, then a slow drip from the far corner, countable, like a patient heartbeat. I followed it to a short flight of stairs that descended into a concrete pocket, a basement that didn't fit the building's footprint. The stone of the first riser had been etched deep, careful numerals with a nail, 1876. The second riser, 11. The third, oh, I wasn't supposed to, I said aloud, and my voice turned thin and priestless in the stale air. Back at the table, I paged to the final spread. There, an index card wrote in a paper sleeve, face down. I slid it free. Not a card, a requisition. Helena Diocesan Archive exhumation request, family plot, Donnelly, any remains. Dated last week. Signed twice. Once in the hand of my current supervisor. Once in mine. The signature was my name, in my cursive, with my peculiar slant on the capital letter I learned in 3rd grade and never unlearned. The ink was fresh enough that the fibers of the card still raised in a nap under my thumb. A phone number had been written in pencil at the bottom. When I lifted the paper to the light, a watermark surfaced, St. Augustine. And beside the second signature, a pencil notation, H.O. holds. Proceed quietly. I left the building, but the smell of the ledger clung to me, tannin in my mouth. The Donnelly name had followed the margins like a small, persistent disease. 11 had followed the paper. O had followed the stairs. My own name had followed the requisition back to me. I know how systems hide their sins, change the registries, call the families by new names, move the dead. But if the hollow doctrine was a policy, it meant someone had turned an argument into a ritual. And if a ritual was still being performed, last week, in my hand, then I wasn't discovering a relic. I was entering an institution that still recognized me. So I went home, washed my hands, and couldn't get free of the catty, metal sweetness. I dialed the number. It rang 11 times. Then someone breathed like a pipe and said, "You found it." I must dig deeper because the person who already knew I would find it is using my name to move bones. The St. Augustine Seminary appeared in Montana's territorial records as early as 1869, founded to provide moral instruction and hygienic care for the region's destitute youth. It sat on a bluff outside Deer Lodge, a pale stone complex with a chapel like a tooth, its bell visible from the northern Pacific line. Official pamphlets, printed by the Helena Herald in 1875, described a charitable and scientific endeavor, a place where fragile children may be brought to health through prayer, proper nourishment, and the careful study of lineage. That phrase, careful study of lineage, was not an accident. It came from Father Elijah Royce, the seminary's founder and first rector. Royce was a Civil War chaplain who, according to the Montana Historical Society's obituary index, left the carnage of the battlefield to shepherd the lost lambs of the western frontier. The archives made him sound saintly, tireless, soft-eyed. His own sermons, preserved in brittle pamphlets, dripped with paternal metaphor: we must tend the orchard, removing what is blighted, to ensure the sweetness of the fruit. But the records I found in the diocesan basement told a cleaner, sharper truth. The seminary operated under dual charters, one ecclesiastical, one territorial. The public charter promised basic education, literacy, catechism. The private charter, stamped with a seal from the Montana Board of Territorial Health, authorized observation, intervention, and correction in cases of inheritable defect. The phrase inheritable defect was underlined twice in blue pencil in a file dated 1874, the year the Donnelly family first appears in the ledgers. What correction meant was less obvious until I requested a microfilm roll from the county coroner's office. It contained cause of death slips, typed and folded into parish baptismal registers. Severe malaise. Prolonged dormancy. Congenital collapse. None of these are medical diagnoses. All were children under 12. And there was this, a hand-bound admissions book from 1869 to 1883. The final column was labeled disposition. For every name, the column carried only 3 possible entries: integrated, reassigned, or retained. There were no dates, no locations, just those words. A marginal note on the first page, in Father Royce's own angular hand, explained: integrated, returned to society. Reassigned, placed with prepared kin. Retained, for further study. It was the retained entries that bothered me most. Dozens of them. Some with the same family name repeated across decades, all carrying a small crossmark beside the word, like a priest's silent amendment to the liturgy. When I drove out to where the seminary should have been, I found nothing but low sage and windnod foundation stones. Yet in the county assessor's database, the property was still tax-exempt, still listed under the name Augustine Holdings, LLC. There was even a current mailing address in Helena, the same street as the diocesan archive. The receptionist at the diocesan office refused to comment when I asked about Augustine Holdings. She said, "That's an old seminary matter. We don't discuss internal programs." Her smile was too symmetrical, like something she'd been taught to wear. A retired nurse from Deer Lodge, whose number I found in the Alumni Association's defunct newsletter, was less cautious. "We knew kids went up there," she said. "Knew they didn't come back. My cousin worked kitchen for one summer. Said there was a wing you couldn't go in without a brass key. If you heard singing from there, it wasn't hymns." She hung up before I could ask about the Donnellys. The official narrative still stands in the state's historic registry, SA. Augustine Seminary, destroyed by fire in 1891, casualty-free. But I'd seen the coroner's slips. I'd read the disposition column. The fire was a fiction. The building's footprint was still visible from satellite imagery, a cross-shaped scar on the bluff. Father Royce's portrait hangs in the Helena Courthouse, 3rd floor, outside the probate office. I stood in front of it last week. He's in his late 40s in the image, the paint cracked across his eyes, the same eyes that wrote retained beside a row of Donnelly children. I don't know if the seminary ever closed. It may have just changed names, like the children it took. But the hollow doctrine, that pairing of mercy and erasure, was the marrow of its existence. And if Augustine Holdings still owns the land, someone still believes in tending the orchard. At first, the trail looked promising: parish baptismals, census cards, alumni rosters from the SA. Augustine Seminary Preparatory Program. But then the records began to collapse into sameness. The names repeated with only small, mechanical variations, as though someone had reshuffled the letters: Conley, Donnellan, Lenedy, Nolden. The birth dates were worse. Out of 63 students listed between 1874 and 1879, 21 shared the exact same date, March 11th. The rest clustered so tightly it was as if a single season had been recycled for decades. I found a sheaf of correspondence in the Montana Historical Society's restricted stacks, letters from supposed graduates. Each began identically: "Dear Sir, I am grateful for the instruction and moral guidance I received during my years at the seminary." The closing paragraphs were equally uniform, as though dictated by the same breath. The penmanship shifted slightly, but the flourishes matched: an exaggerated loop on the capital G, a pinched final Y. These weren't memories, they were issued statements. It was the living accounts that unsettled me most. Through a former diocesan custodian named Avery Pike, I was introduced to an elderly woman in Missoula who had been a guest boarder at St. Augustine's during the late 1940s, long after it was supposedly defunct. She insisted her name was Miriam, but when I asked her surname, she hesitated so long her tea went cold. "They gave us new names," she finally said. "Not all at once. They'd say it by accident, at first. You'd answer without meaning to. Then your letters home would come back, returned, because there was no one by your old name at that address." Her hands trembled as she described a ritual in the refectory: birthdays announced after supper, everyone clapping for the month's celebrants. "It didn't matter when you were born," she whispered. "They said the date, you stood." We all stood. When I asked if she remembered her true birth date, she stared at her reflection in the tea until it quivered. "I think it was in winter. Or, they told me that." Avery took me to a storage yard outside Helena, where the seminary's salvaged stone lintels were stacked under tarps. One of them bore a row of names carved deep into the sandstone, children's names, the letters weather-soft but still readable. Every name had been scratched out with a chisel, leaving only ragged scars. Someone had then carved new names above the old, but the alignment was off, the ghosts of the originals still pulsed beneath. Another lead came from a faded staff photo, dated 1880, labeled "Instructors, St. Augustine Seminary." Every figure stood stiff-backed in identical cassocks, their faces different but their eyes painted with the same uncanny shade, a retouching so deliberate it erased individuality. Worse, the two women in the back row, though labeled with different names, were clearly the same person photographed twice, hair rearranged, mouth set differently. I started cross-referencing obituary notices and found gaps wide enough to swallow lives. People simply stopped existing in the public record: not dead, not married, not migrated. Gone. In the requisition ledger for reassigned students, I found a marginal note in Father Royce's hand: "The orchard thrives when no one recalls which tree bore which fruit." The words had been underlined in what looked like modern ballpoint pen. Someone had read it recently. What the hollow doctrine took first was not the body, but the frame of the self, the memory that told you were singular. Names, dates, letters, faces, all stripped, replaced, filed under something that could be safely forgotten. Miriam, if that was her name, pressed a folded scrap into my palm before I left. It was the corner of an old ledger page, the ink faint. 3 words: "Don't answer twice." The bluff above Deer Lodge still holds the seminary's bones, a foundation grid hidden by sage and scrub pine, where the wind carries the sound of a bell that hasn't rung since the 19th century. But it isn't the surface that matters. It's what's underneath. Avery Pike, the retired custodian, had a brass key. Found it in a coat pocket, he said, though he didn't say whose coat. The key didn't match any known lock on the remaining ruins. It matched one beneath them. We descended through a drainage culvert at the bluff's edge, into air that smelled of wet stone and iron filings. The tunnel widened into a stairwell of mismatched steps, some limestone, some wood, some poured concrete. My flashlight revealed numbers carved into every fifth riser, 3, 8, 11, and then it would start again. We passed the sequence twice before I realized we were looping without turning. When the stairs finally stopped, we were standing before a wall of green-painted steel with a keyhole at its center. The brass fit perfectly. The door swung inward without a sound. The chamber beyond was impossible for the footprint of the bluff, a long hall with alcoves, each curtained with rotten velvet. Behind the first curtain was a narrow bed with leather restraints at wrist and ankle. The mattress was horsehair, dented in the shape of a small body. A corked bottle sat on the floor beside it, labeled in flaking ink, Laudanum, St. Augustine Pharmacy. The next alcove held a chair bolted to the floor, facing a blank wall less than a foot away. The plaster had been worn smooth where a forehead had rested against it. At the far end of the hall stood a narrow altar. On it, 3 candles burned, and they were burning when we entered, though the air was still and no matches lay nearby. The wax pooled in neat circles, as if someone tended them. I reached out to cup one and the flame leaned toward me, as though in recognition. Avery wouldn't come closer. They did silence therapy here, he muttered. Days without speech. Opiates in the water. Then, whatever came after. There were side doors along the hall, but one in particular made me stop. It was set into the wall at an angle that defied the rest of the corridor, as though the building had been forced to accommodate it. When I opened it, I found a narrow stairwell descending steeply, but after the third step, my flashlight showed a landing with no exit. Still, the air on my face told me the space beyond was vast. We found photographs in a filing cabinet at the base of the altar. Glossy black and white prints, much newer than the rest of the place, 1960s at least. They showed small groups of people in hospital gowns, seated in concentric circles on the floor of the very hall we stood in. Their eyes were closed, mouths open as if singing, but there were no hymnals. A chalk diagram on the floor beneath them resembled a target. One photo, slipped between 2 others, showed the same group, but now the circle was empty. No people, no chairs, nothing. Just the chalk mark and 3 candles in the center. When I looked back at the altar, the candles were gone. The wax circles remained, still warm. Somewhere deep in the hall, behind a curtain we had not yet touched, came the slow sound of breathing. Not human, not entirely. Each inhale dragged like a long pull through gravel. Avery dropped the brass key into my hand and stepped back toward the steel door. This isn't all of it, he said. They built down, then in, then under. The rooms move. You can walk for hours and end up behind where you started. I didn't follow him out immediately. Something in the air was calling names, not aloud, but in the bones of my teeth. And one of them was mine. The clue was a box of transfer slips I found in the Diocesan Archives miscellaneous shelf, folded into an unlabeled banker's box, wedged between parish budgets and hymn licensing agreements. The slips were all printed with the seminary's letterhead but listed destinations far outside Montana: St. Ignatius Mission School, Idaho; Holy Vale Preparatory, Kansas; Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy, Alberta. Some bore no address at all, just a symbol, a small hollow circle bisected by a vertical line. The dates stretched across a century. The earliest, 1875. The latest, 1994. A folded map tucked in the bottom showed the western states speckled with tiny black dots. Each dot was marked with the same circle and line emblem. In the margin, someone had written holding sites, active as of 1978. When I cross-referenced the names on the transfer slips with public records, the pattern grew teeth. Institutions that had burned down or relocated reappeared under different names in other states, often within a year. Their alumni rosters showed the same anomalies I'd seen at SA. Augustine, repeating birthdays, scrambled surnames, and the integrated/reassigned/retained disposition system. It wasn't just a school, or even a network of schools. It was a lattice of custody, a web designed to catch and contain certain families, certain lineages, certain inheritable defects in the eyes of whoever ran it. And then I found my own name. It was buried in a microfilmed ledger from Holy Vale Preparatory, 1968, under Prospective Reassignment List. My grandmother's name was on the same page, maiden surname, birth year correct, disposition marked integrated. But there was a faint pencil mark in the retained column, half erased. The ledger noted her transfer in 1947 from St. Augustine Seminary, Ward H. Ward H, the same letter that appeared in HO in the original ledger I'd found weeks ago. There was also a cover sheet stamped with a name I'd never seen before, Order of the Fifth Veil. Below it, in smaller text, Custodians of the Doctrine. The language was bureaucratic, not mystical. Talk of genetic stewardship, anonymity protocols, and ritual continuity across sites. In the Helena Courthouse basement, I found a registry book labeled Property Holdings Ecclesiastical Trusts. Augustine Holdings was listed, but so were 47 other LLCs, all with different names but identical mailing addresses. The signatories rotated, but one name recurred every few decades, a matronly signature, steady and precise, Sister Clarice Hoyt. The earliest occurrence I saw was 1892, the latest was 1987. If it was the same woman, she would have been well over a century old. The transfer map had one more note in the corner, circle on floor equals target point. I remembered the 1960s photograph from the underground chamber, the chalk diagram beneath the silent patients. The map suggested there were dozens of such rooms across the country. I thought of Miriam in Missoula, unable to recall her true surname. Of Avery refusing to cross the threshold of certain doors. And of my grandmother, smiling in a photo from 1951, holding my mother as a baby, both of them standing just slightly to the left of the camera, as though making space for something unseen. This was never about one seminary, one bluff, one priest. The hollow doctrine was the root system beneath a forest of false institutions. The Order of the Fifth Veil tended that root, pruning, grafting, erasing. And if my name had appeared in their files once, I had to wonder whether it had been erased and rewritten again since. Whether the person I believed myself to be was just the latest version of someone the Order had been tending for generations. I was back beneath the bluff, brass key in my palm, when I found the room I hadn't dared open before. The angled door from my first descent had shifted, now it stood flush with the wall, as though it had been waiting for me to return. Inside was a small chamber lined with wooden benches. The air was warm and carried the smell of beeswax and something sweeter, lavender, maybe, or decay disguised as comfort. At the center stood a child. Thin, barefoot, head shaved. A white shift hung from their shoulders like it had been handed down too many times. Beside them, an old woman in a veil adjusted a length of cloth around the child's eyes. Spiritual correction, she murmured. Her voice had the patient certainty of someone tying a knot they'd tied all their life. I stepped forward, but the woman didn't acknowledge me. The child lifted their chin toward me and spoke softly, "Will it matter if I get out?" The question broke something in my chest. I'd brought a recorder. My plan was to collect enough proof to hand over to a journalist friend in Billings. The map, the ledgers, the photos, it would be enough to collapse the Order's public facade. But I'd read the files. Exposure meant every name in those ledgers would be public record. Survivors who'd built new lives would have their histories cracked open like a wound. Families would be dragged back into the doctrine's language, defect, lineage, correction, whether they wanted it or not. And then there were those who hadn't escaped. The retained. Some might not survive the transition into a world that didn't believe them. Some might not even remember enough to stand on their own. The veiled woman began to hum low, tuneless, almost mechanical. The child's hands twitched at their sides. I could end this. A few calls, the right reporter, the documents mailed in bulk. The Order would burn in the daylight. But I could already see the stories written in its ashes. Obscure historical custody program exposed, questions remain. The survivors reduced to curiosities. The real machinery would vanish underground again, more careful, more hidden. Or I could erase the trail here, seal the records, destroy the files, cut the thread so the map no longer led anywhere. The Order's legacy would remain unproven, but a few of the living, including this child, if I could move quickly enough, might walk away without being turned into evidence. The child tilted their head again, blindfold slipping enough for one eye to meet mine. It was calm, unblinking. Not asking for rescue. Asking for memory. I took the recorder from my pocket. Pressed stop. Slid the tape free. The veiled woman began wrapping the blindfold tighter. I crossed the room, took the child's hand, and pulled them toward the door. For a moment, I thought the woman would stop me. Instead, she stepped aside, humming the same note. We left the chamber. Avery was waiting by the steel door. He didn't ask questions, just pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand, an address in another state, no name. They won't look there, he said. Back at my apartment, I placed the ledgers, the map, the photographs, and the tape recorder in a cardboard box. I struck a match and watched the paper curl inward, blackening into silence. Only one thing I kept, the candle from the altar. I lit it in my window. The wax pooled in a perfect circle, warm in the dark. Some things I would remember. The rest I would let burn. The Helena Chronicle ran a 2-paragraph story, small fire destroys storage annex. No injuries reported. The accompanying photo showed a metal bin warped by heat and a length of chain link fence bowed inward. The article cited an electrical fault. It didn't mention that the annex had no electricity, no grid connection, no official reason to exist. The diocesan press release called it an unfortunate loss of miscellaneous archival property of no historical significance. The word miscellaneous carried more weight than the rest of the statement combined. In the weeks that followed, I watched the digital footprints vanish, county assessor pages revised, LLC listings closed or merged, maps updated to erase the bluff's cross-shaped scar. Even the microfilm at the Montana Historical Society came back with black leader threaded through the relevant years. What they missed were the quiet things. Avery told me the child, whose name I never asked, was safe. Somewhere far from here, where birthdays aren't a sign and doors stay in one place. But I don't know if they remember my face, or if the doctrine has already thinned it in their mind until it's just another fixed smile in a ledger. The storage yard where the lintels sat was cleared within days. The carved names, scratched out and overwritten, were carted away. The driver swore he'd been told it was scrapstone. But when he delivered the load, the yard was empty, no one to receive it, no signature required. In the charred remains of my apartment's burn bin, I found one thing that had refused to curl into ash. A small brass locket. I hadn't seen it before. The hinge was stiff, and inside was a child's sketch on brittle paper, 2 stick figures holding hands, the taller one marked with a circle and a line through it. Beneath them, in shaky letters, "Don't answer twice." It sits on my desk now, the hinge still warm to the touch when I pick it up, as if it remembers heat. The bluff is quiet these days. The sage has already started to reclaim the foundation grid. From the highway, you'd never know a building had stood there. But when the wind comes off the flats just right, I swear I can hear the bell, not ringing, but breathing. In my sleep, I still see the first ledger, black buckram, wax-sliced clasp, the neat ink columns repeating Donnelly, infant, Donnelly, mater, Donnelly, pater, and the notation H.O. I still taste the tannic sweetness of its paper. And when I wake, there's always a number at the back of my tongue, waiting to be spoken. The official files say nothing. The public records say nothing. The people who might have remembered are silent, or scripted. But I know what I wasn't supposed to find. And I know it's still finding me. 1.